It's hard for a person to be sure of their own reality, because we're constantly changing inside. It's not like there's a crystal ball version of ourselves inside us. The various channels of the media feed into this. People tend to think that reality is however each person sees it. Of course, famous Hollywood movies also deal with these themes, suggesting that everything is completely relative, so there's no such thing as reality. This idea is actually quite popular, but when we look at the reality of the situation, things aren't like that at all. Even if we want to give up on reality, reality doesn't give up on us.
Hello to everyone from Istanbul School, dear viewers. This week, our guest is Dr. Yasin Ramazan. Welcome, Professor. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much. Professor, this week we want to talk with you about the issue of reality. Your latest book, Reality Again, also covers this topic. By the way, congratulations on your new book.
Thanks.
How would you define it? What is truth? What is reality? Let's start with these a little bit.
Yes, in the book Reality Again, we're actually in a process related to the return of metaphysics, and that's what I'm trying to explain. Because reality is under threat. Now, defining what reality is, of course, is very difficult and actually impossible. But we can define the concept of reality. We can talk about it. And actually, at some point, we have to do this. Even though it slips through our fingers every time, even though we can't come up with a completely comprehensive definition, we can't give up on reality. But we've moved past an era where we thought we no longer needed reality. And as a result, we are faced with a world of thought that believes truth, reality, goodness, and beauty are entirely dependent on circumstances and acts accordingly. We are faced with a world of action and movement shaped by this. Social media feeds into this. Various branches of the media feed into this as well. It's assumed that reality is however each person perceives it. Of course, famous Hollywood movies also deal with these themes. Everything is completely relative, so there's no such thing as reality, and so on. This idea has become quite popular as well. From the perspective of imagination, some pretty interesting things are emerging. Really captivating stuff is coming out. But when we look at the reality of the situation, things aren't like that at all. Even if we want to give up on reality, reality doesn't give up on us. We keep thinking about it. Because, first of all, there are many concepts that are the opposite of reality and the concept of the real, which allow us to use those terms. For example, there's dreaming. We make a distinction between dreams and reality, and there's something specific we mean by that. Of course, a dream is also a reality. It's real too. But the meaning we refer to when we say something is more real than a dream doesn't go away. It's always with us. Or, for instance, you have a friend, you have a close companion. We can define the difference between the two as true friendship, as reality. So, in fact, we're faced with a concept that we can never really give up, and yet we're dealing with a culture that has turned its back on it. How are we going to confront this? I think this confrontation needs to happen, and I'm trying to make it happen.
You use the phrase more real here, Professor. I mean, more real than a dream. So, is this reality here something like a ranking? There's something that's a bit more real, and something that's less real. So, can we see this as a kind of grading or rating?
Well, of course, when we say real, what comes to mind is that there's the real thing, and then there are the fakes. That's one meaning of reality. But actually, we define what is real and what is more real with two things. One of them is permanence. We think that things that are permanent are more real, because we can test them against more things. So, things that are permanent, for example, time is something permanent. Because time itself endures, we feel that it's very real. For example, Even though there are debates about relativity in time itself, time doesn't go anywhere. Our perception of it is one thing, and measuring time based on mass is another, but its reality is something else entirely. So we can't say that time isn't real. That's why permanence is one of the first things we think of when it comes to time. In other words, it's a criterion for what we consider to be real. The other criterion is that reality, or what is real, should be widespread. In other words, it should be broad enough to be relevant to everything. So, the idea of a local reality is a bit of an oxymoron. Because if there is a reality somewhere in the universe, that reality is connected to the reality of an atom on Earth. Therefore, reality is a whole. This is our second criterion for reality. It needs to be broad enough to encompass everything as a whole. It needs to be inclusive.
Actually, there isn't a precise definition, but it seems like reality has different qualities.
Of course, making a definition goes like this. Traditionally, to define something, you have to leave out things that don't fit that definition. But we can't leave anything outside of reality. That's why it's hard to define. For this reason, for example, there are thinkers who say that reality is directly God. That is, the truth is God.
Actually, with the concept of truth, it's almost as if God is the one who is true. There seems to be a connection there as well, since the truth comes from that.
Of course, the concept of truth is used very frequently. In this sense, it's something that comes up a lot in discussions about reality, and traditionally, the terminology is actually covered by the word truth. But today, we need to distinguish between reality and truth, because these debates about truth take place on a more epistemic level, whereas debates about reality are metaphysical discussions. In other words, since the criteria for truth have changed, especially in post-Kantian philosophy and modern science, we can carry on those debates without necessarily touching on discussions about reality. But in some way, they're still interconnected. For example, today it's said that we live in a post-truth world. This actually means both a post-reality world and a post-truth world. In other words, nothing is true anymore. Everything is relative, subjective, and as a result, it feels like it's impossible to truly know anything. The fact that these discussions are connected doesn't mean that we have to approach them in a connected way. I think that when we address them separately, we get clearer and more accurate results.
And also, when we look at the connection between our perception of reality today, for example, you mentioned social media, and there's also artificial intelligence. It actually seems like our perception of reality here is changing more and more each day, Professor.
All of these can actually be considered as a layer of reality. For example, what we call social reality is one dimension of reality. As a social species that lives together, a significant part of our reality comes from other people. This starts in infancy, and later on, during school years and even as adults in our professional lives, we always have to derive a certain level of reality from society. In fact, language itself is something directly related to society. Would language even exist if there were no society? It's something that's debated, and according to most philosophers, language is actually used as a tool for socialization. Is that really the case? That's a separate topic for discussion. But since it's relevant here, I think it's worth mentioning. We acquire reality through language. In other words, the language we use determines how we perceive reality. But here, we also need to point out that there is a difference between perception and reality. Because, in fact, there is an approach that reduces all of reality to perception. And I specifically wrote this book to defend reality against that perception. In other words, to defend reality against that definition.
You're disrupting perception operations.
Yes, perception operations remain just that, perception operations. I mean, we need to be aware of this because, well, there's something else to consider. The control of perception is also an issue. In other words, we're not a species that lives only through our five senses. We filter these things. Our mind is always trying to perceive by organizing the incoming data. For those who claim that perceptions replace reality, there is no reality other than perception. And this idea, starting from Berkeley to Kant, and then to Hegel and the later German idealists, largely reaches the point where perception equals reality. Some claim that this perception is subjective, while others argue that it is objective. But it stems from the idea that there is nowhere we can reach other than perception, that there is no reality. Of course, perception is very important, but for example, there is also a plane where we can verify our perception. In other words, some of these are what we call transcendent or transcendental, the realities we live in, and we can also observe the changes in these realities. If those realities were nothing but perception, we wouldn't be able to see those changes either. But our reality, and reality itself, also has a variable structure for us.
Let's also talk a bit about the relationship between reality and psychology, if you like. Because, again, it actually ties back to perception here. But this thing we call reality, may not always be the kind of reality we usually understand. Here, I mean, in connection with psychology. Because reality is mostly something that belongs to humans. And since we see it as something related to human perception, if you could talk a bit about its psychological background.
Of course, this is also something that defines the concept of reality. I mean, philosophers have actually debated things like whether we should include psychology in philosophy. Accusations of psychologism are made frequently. It's not exactly clear who is a psychologist, but everyone accuses each other of being a psychologist. Setting that aside, it's really difficult to discuss reality. Because actually, can we really understand any concept or any idea by abstracting it from our own conditions, independent of our psychology? That's very doubtful. That's why, actually, reality, up to a certain point, especially during our developmental years, it's something we live in, like air, like an atmosphere. We're not aware of it. But at some point, our sense of reality starts to get shaken. We can call this adolescence, or we can call it certain traumas. In other words, the things you thought were true, the things that kept life going, the things that, as I just said, were unchanging and permanent, suddenly you see that they actually change, that they're not permanent, and you start to understand that. And this leads to traumas. Trauma means that our sense of reality shifts, wobbles, gets shaken, and sometimes even collapses. And when your sense of reality is shaken or collapses, your entire world of meaning collapses too. Everything you found meaning in falls apart. Your relationships fall apart. The things you valued in life, your job, your career, your relationships with loved ones, all of them change.
Everything was a lie.
Everything starts to feel like a lie. That's when we use the concept of a lie. This is related to reality. Like, everything was meaningless. Everything was a lie. For example, if there's a war, the war shakes the reality you're living in, and you are born into a new reality. In fact, trauma basically means our process of adapting to a new reality. As a species, we humans are actually quite good at adapting. Our mind has a very intense structure when it comes to adaptation and self-reflection. So we can experience this process very intensely. Therefore, when the processes in which we adapt to reality feel like psychological destruction, most of the time it's actually an adaptation to a new reality, a process where we are being restructured.
Yes, there's both a destruction there and then a rebuilding. But the reality that gets destroyed is also our reality. And the one that's newly built is also our reality.
We're building it with the same materials anyway. So when we fall apart, we don't just leave behind what's been destroyed and create something completely new over here. There's no such process. We start rebuilding with the same materials that were destroyed. In fact, from my observation and personal experience, we never stay where we've fallen apart. As soon as something collapses, something new immediately starts to be built. So whether you want it or not, something new is being created. But you can either manage this process or just let it happen on its own. If you try to overmanage it, you end up overthinking. If you don't try to manage it at all, then you become indifferent. And if there's no control in your life, you might turn into an anxious person. But all of these actually show a process of transformation. In other words, a process of adapting to a new reality. And whether we want to or not, we're trying to reach a sense of reality. Is this an ultimate reality? No, it's not. That will also collapse. That too will be renewed, transformed, and changed. So, a personality independent of the idea of reality doesn't exist either. There is no such thing as a psychiatrist.
It's a constant cycle of destruction and construction. In fact, maybe the biggest destruction in every area of our lives happens during adolescence, as we transition into adulthood, because there are realities we've adopted and accepted from childhood. There are ruins of these. But throughout our lives, at any moment, we can experience this shaking and crumbling of reality.
We can experience it. And so, what can we do in response to these things? How can we cope with a major destruction? Like you said, it might be a process that starts in adolescence. Or, for example, there are deaths in our lives. People leave our lives. New people come into our lives. We leave our jobs. We move to another country. We change cities. So when our habits change, there are also tremors in our reality. It takes time to perceive and understand these things. We need to give ourselves that time because, as I said, time is the most enduring reality. And it's the most important criterion that can show us what is truly real. And when we give it time, we start to reach the second criterion more easily. That is, our definitions of what that all-encompassing thing is. Sometimes we define this as the world. We say the world and actually mean everything. Sometimes we say everything, sometimes the universe, sometimes God. So, to be able to see the new form it takes, we need to look at it again and again.
Actually, that's exactly what I was going to ask. Amidst all this destruction, what is the reality that will never be destroyed, the one that is permanent? Here, you say it's time. You also say that, depending on one's understanding, it could sometimes be God. It seems like it's something that can take different forms, maybe even shaped by one's lifestyle. Maybe everyone has a reality in life that will never change, that is permanent. Can we look at it this way, Professor?
Of course. I mean, we need that. Psychologically, we're always searching for that permanent thing. But our perception of it doesn't have to be permanent. For example, you have a concept of God. There's a perception of God you formed in childhood, largely using your imagination. This can change or transform as you grow up. And in fact, it needs to change. Because this isn't something that can be shaped by imagination alone. Reality changes. But the reality of God may not change. Your belief that the ultimate reality is God might even become stronger.
That reminds me of something a friend of mine once said. When I was little, I used to think that God was the one reciting the call to prayer. Perceptions in childhood, the concept of God at that age, can be different. It can be something else entirely. But maybe what's more important is the unshakable nature of the core principles, the fundamental reality there. Like the part that is real and cannot be destroyed. Here, I'm actually trying to look at it more from the perspective of young people. Because, as you said, it's mostly young people who go through this confrontation with reality. It could be adolescence, or it could be other periods. People want to hold on to something more unshakable, because psychological breakdowns can be much more devastating for some individuals.
The biggest issue there is actually the question, how real am I? Right? I mean, this can happen during adolescence, but people can always experience these kinds of doubts. I mean, how real am I? How real are the things that come from within me?
This is a more difficult question.
It's a very difficult question, and it's not a question that lets you go or puts you at ease. It's hard for a person to be sure of their own reality for this reason. Inside, we're constantly changing. It's not like we have a crystal ball inside us, a fixed self. We are influenced by our surroundings. We change over time, and sometimes we feel like we've betrayed ourselves. Like, I used to never do this, but now I do, or I used to do that, but now I don't. When we fall into this kind of doubt, we might even question our own reality, how real we actually are. Of course, this is especially tough at a young age. Since our character is still developing, inevitably, sometimes drifting away from something we love makes us feel disconnected from reality. Or because our relationships are often based on much more fleeting things, especially friends and our social circle. Every change in these areas triggers changes in our personality as well. Getting used to those changes is basically what maturing means. So, relationships with parents change, relationships with siblings change, relationships with a partner change, relationships with society change, and even relationships with God change. It's hard to figure out which one of these is actually real, but even when we think we've found it, we don't always hold on to it. that changes too. So, the truth isn't like some unchanging crystal ball that we can just grab as a catchy slogan and say, it's inside that reality. It has to be something more transcendent so that we can even explain our own changes with it. For example, when we place all of reality within a person's own thoughts and mind, we end up facing this situation. With an egocentric perspective, we become the measure of everything. In other words, it becomes all about ourselves. This is where we see the rise of narcissism. We see people believing in the superiority of their own class, group, or race. Because the ego becomes extremely fragile. When you put the ego at the very center, it becomes very fragile. You try to put it way up high because you believe anything could shake your sense of reality. To keep it from cracking, you belittle another race, another gender, another community, or another group, and in the end, reality starts to be perceived as your own superiority. So, where does this come from? It comes from thinking that the ego is unchangeable. But actually, the ego changes, and it needs to change. What doesn't change has to be something beyond that. It has to be above this, beyond us.
So, Professor, you actually talked about this reality issue in detail in your book, but is that all there is to it here? So, when we finish the book, will we have understood reality?
Of course, all the truths are in the book. No. This started as a process. Here, I wanted to start a discussion, or rather, to join a discussion that had already started very gradually. This needs to continue. These views need to be discussed. Because none of us can have absolute opinions about reality. That's the biggest difference between us and the classical world. We are not in a position to believe that our perception of reality or our judgments about reality are absolute. I mean, we might believe in something absolute. For example, you might believe that God is absolute, but our beliefs themselves are not absolute. They, too, are subject to change. Reality is the same way. You might believe that there is an absolute reality, but that doesn't mean your beliefs won't change. Because all of us are limited beings, but reality has to be unlimited.
That was great. Really, Professor, we've truly put the facts on the table. Thank you very much. And once again, congratulations on your book. Let's take this opportunity to recommend it as well. Dear viewers, our studio guest this week was Professor Yasin Ramazan. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.